So let's officially start. So welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for all of you that are joining us from different parts of the world. We are very happy to have you all in this new session of the Indiana Leeds Summer Tax Workshop Series. I'm Dr. Leopoldo Parada from the University of Leeds, and I'm co-hosting the series with my dear colleague Leandra Lederman, who is going now to introduce herself and our speaker.
Thank you so much, Leopoldo. So I am Leandra Lederman. I'm the William W. Oliver Professor of Tax Law at Indiana University Maurer School of Law in Bloomington, Indiana. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor James R. Repetti, who is the inaugural holder of the William J. Keneally S.J. Chair at Boston College Law School. He is an author of the text Partnership Income Taxation, Introduction to United States International Taxation, Federal Wealth Transfer Taxation, Problems in Federal Wealth Transfer Taxation, and Tax Aspects of Organizing and Operating a Business. He has acted as a consultant to the U.S. Senate, Internal Revenue Service, and the Justice Department, and he has appeared as a commentator on publications such as the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, Marketplace, Boston Globe, Christian Science Monitor, and Forbes magazine. And today we are thrilled to have him here presenting his paper on the appropriate roles for equity and efficiency in a progressive income tax. Go ahead, Jim.
Okay, I just wanted to unmute. And thank you very much, Leandra and Leopoldo. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I look forward to your comments. Let me now try to share my screen here. And okay, it worked. I'm always happy when modern technology actually works. So the title of my paper is The Appropriate Roles for Equity and Efficiency in a Progressive Income Tax. And the reason for my paper really stems from the increased dominance of efficiency concerns over equity concerns in formulating tax policy. Over the past several decades, efficiency concerns have come to dominate U.S. tax policy. As early as 1988, Peter Kilborn stated in a New York Times article, quote, "Beneath the current Washington debate over raising taxes lies a fundamental change in thinking about the federal tax system. In most previous discussions, there was a strong emphasis on redistributing income from the well-off to the less well-off. But now the tax system is being viewed as a tool to build a more efficient economy, not a fairer one." The increased emphasis on efficiency is illustrated by the significant decreases in the maximum statutory rates. And that's illustrated in this graph. Since the mid-1960s, the maximum statutory tax rate decreased from over 70% to the current 40.8%. And you can see in the middle of the graph, the tax rate in the mid-60s was approximately 70%, and by 2018, it had decreased to 40.8%. At the same time that our statutory tax rates decrease, progressivity has also decreased. The effective tax rates for the top 1% have decreased since the 1960s, as illustrated by this graph. The top line shows the decreasing effective tax rates for the top 1%, beginning in the mid-1960s and ending in 2014 on this graph. And note that the bottom 50% in the US, the effective tax rate for the bottom 50% actually has increased since the mid-1960s to the 2000s. The result has been a compression in the effective tax rates, with the highest income people experiencing lower effective tax rates, while the higher income taxpayers are experiencing higher effective tax rates. Why has efficiency become so important in the US? Partly, I think it's attributable to the fact that predictions of gains from achieving efficiency appear more certain than gains from achieving equity through progressive tax rates. Efficiency gains seem quantifiable, while equity gains appear intangible and unmeasurable. In addition, many forms of distributive justice underlie tax equity, and not all forms require progressive tax rates. So the result is that even if somebody is a proponent of more equity, the underlying forms of distributive justice do not necessarily lead to a progressive tax rate. For example, the ability to pay doctrine, the theory that has historically had a major influence on structuring tax systems, only requires progressive rates in certain scenarios that involve declining marginal utility. In contrast to the intangible nature of equity, efficiency analysis creates an appearance of certainty. Calculation of the excess burden of an income tax, for example, predicts that a decrease in the tax inclusive rate from 50% to 25% shrinks the excess burden to 1/9 of its former size. As a result, even small decreases in the tax rate seem quite inviting because of the potential efficiency gains. These concerns about efficiency really dominated most of my career. When I started practicing law, and then when I entered the academy, the major debate involved the efficiency of a consumption tax versus the efficiency of an income tax. Subsequently, we also had debates about the efficiency of the estate tax versus the income tax. And throughout these debates, I kept looking at the empirical studies that were coming out, analyzing some of the elasticities involved with respect to savings and labor, and they seem to be largely inconclusive. When you looked at the studies as a whole, there really was no bright line that you could point to that would suggest that there is in fact a harmful relationship between the individual income tax and savings and labor. And that's evidenced, I think, in some of the discussion that I have in my paper. The problem with the large efficiency gains that are predicted by excess burden calculations is that they are based upon assumptions about human behavior that have not been empirically verified. The excess burden calculation assumes that the elasticity of the compensated demand curve for the item being taxed can be accurately determined. Theory, however, cannot predict how taxpayers will respond to tax. Indeed, theory predicts that taxpayers, as you know, may respond in two opposite ways to taxation. For example, consider a tax on the income from savings. Theory suggests that the taxpayer may increase their savings in response to a tax, and we know this as the so-called income effect, or they may decrease their savings by increasing consumption, the substitution effect. Similarly, a tax on wages may increase labor supply or decrease it. Thus, the actual impact of taxes on behavior becomes an empirical question. As you know, economists estimate the responsiveness of labor supply to taxes by calculating the labor supply elasticity, a fraction that compares the percentage change in hours worked to the percentage change in wages. When the fraction is less than 1, the response is said to be inelastic. This means that the percentage change in labor is less than the percentage change in wages. On the other hand, if the fraction is greater than 1, the percentage change in labor supply exceeds the percentage change in wages. Interestingly enough, when you look at the empirical studies as a whole, the analysis of the impact of income taxes on the labor supply of men in the US suggests little or no effect. A leading labor economics textbook, which was published this year, summarized the empirical results as follows. Quote, "There is a lot of variation in existing estimates of the labor supply elasticity. Some studies report the elasticity to be 0. Other studies report it to be large and negative. Still others to be large and positive. There have been some attempts to determine which estimates are most credible. These surveys conclude that the elasticity of male labor supply is roughly about negative 0.1. In other words, a 10% increase in the wages leads on average to a 1% decrease in hours of work for men. Historically, however, income taxes have had an empirically greater impact on the labor supply of married women. The reason for this is that, or it's thought that the reason for this is that when married women enter the labor market outside the home, they have to find a substitute to perform all the services that were being performed in the home. And of course, they're going to be paying that substitute labor in the home with after-tax income. So they have been empirically, at least historically, much more sensitive to the after-tax return on labor supplied outside the home. However, interestingly, the elasticity of married women has been moving and is converging with the elasticity for men. A 2016 National Tax Journal article stated, quote, with male labor supply elasticity believed to be close to zero, the finding that female elasticities have converged toward those of males has significant implications for tax policy and optimal tax rates. Inelastic male and female labor supplies means that distortions from higher taxes could now be significantly smaller than previously thought. While economists have reached a consensus that taxes have little or no effect on labor supply in the US, there is less agreement about the impact of taxes on savings. Douglas Bernheim, a highly respected economist, described the state of research in 2002, stating, quote, as an economist, one that cannot review the voluminous literature on taxation and saving without being somewhat humbled by the enormous difficulty of learning anything useful about even the most basic empirical questions. Having been handed two grand experiments with tax policy during the 1980s, IRAs and 401ks, and those were both incentives to increase pension contributions, it would seem that we ought to have learned more and to have achieved greater consensus than we have. In our defense, it can be said that we have done our best with the information at our disposal. Well, that was 2002. Little has changed in the succeeding years. Jonathan Gruber, in his leading public finance textbook, which was published in 2019, stated, quote, in contrast to the case of labor supply, there is little consensus about the impact of taxes on the interest rate on savings decisions. Indeed, economists aren't even in agreement whether income taxes have a negative, zero, or even positive impact on savings. In other words, the empirical evidence doesn't show, or at least is not in agreement with respect to whether the income effect is dominant or with respect to whether the substitution effect is dominant. I might add, as I discussed in the papers, a lot of economists think that the trend in the literature is to show that it has no impact, but I think the evidence to date is still inconclusive, so we really can't reach a decision about that. Interestingly enough, a 2018 OECD study, a survey of studies that analyzed the impact of tax incentives designed to increase retirement savings, also concluded that the literature is unclear. The 2018 OECD survey stated, quote, the literature is far from conclusive on whether tax incentives lead to an increase in national savings or instead a reallocation of savings. Interestingly, 8 of the articles in the OECD study used data from the US. Indicative of the inconclusive nature of the empirical studies, 4 found that tax incentives increased aggregate savings, while 4 found no relationship. Interestingly, while we don't seem to have a consensus at all about the impact of taxation on savings, and there seems to be a consensus that the impact of taxation on labor is relatively insignificant or perhaps zero, there is quite a bit of empirical evidence showing an association between inequality and social harms, poor health, poor intergenerational mobility, and also harms to our democratic political process. Epidemiologists Wilkinson and Pickett, who I believe are not too far from the University of Leeds, have studied a variety of health and social problems that appear related to inequality. They constructed an index of health and social problems to determine whether these problems correlate with inequality. The index incorporates life expectancy, math skills and literacy, infant mortality, homicides, imprisonment, teenage births, level of trust, obesity, mental illness, and social mobility. They found a remarkable correlation between these social ills and inequality. This graph shows their findings. The y-axis, which is the vertical axis, is the index of health and social problems. And it increases, the problems increase as you go from the bottom of the graph to the upper part of the graph. The x-axis, which is the horizontal line, shows increasing income inequality. And if you look at the graph, you'll note that there's a pretty clear correlation between increasing income inequality and increasing social and health harms. In fact, if you look closely at the graph, you'll see the USA in the upper right-hand corner with the highest level of income inequality in this sample, and also with the highest index of health and social problems. Down at the bottom of the graph, you'll see Japan with the lowest level of income inequality and the lowest level of health and social problems. Pickett and Wilkinson have broken out their indices to look at individual components of potential problems. And another graph that they have is the relationship between life expectancy and income inequality. And again here, the y-axis, which is the vertical axis, shows increasing life expectancy. And the horizontal axis, the x-axis, shows income inequality, which is increasing as you proceed from the left to the right. And once again, you'll note that the US is in the lower right-hand corner with the second highest level of income inequality in this sample, and also with one of the lowest levels of life expectancy. Again, we see the relationship between infant mortality and income inequality. The y-axis of this graph shows increasing infant deaths per 1,000 live births. The x-axis shows increasing income inequality. And once again, you'll see the US in the upper right-hand corner with the second highest level of income inequality. There's a little dot, by the way, at the bottom. That was Singapore. I'm not sure why it didn't come out in my PowerPoint here, but the US has the second highest level of income inequality in this sample, and we have, unfortunately, the highest level of infant mortality. Also, intergenerational mobility is adversely affected by inequality. One of the most ominous aspects of significant inequality is that families may become trapped in lower economic levels for generations. Former chair of the US Federal Reserve System, Janet Yellen, observed that one of the harms arising from inequality is that it affects opportunity for advancement. She stated, "Some degrees of inequality in income and wealth, of course, would occur even with completely equal opportunity, because variations in effort, skill, and luck will produce variations in outcome. Indeed, some variation in outcome arguably contributes to economic growth because it creates incentives to work hard, get an education, save, invest, and undertake risk. However, to the extent that opportunity itself is enhanced by access to economic resources, inequality of outcomes can exacerbate inequality of opportunity, thereby perpetuating a trend of increasing inequality. Such a link is suggested by the so-called Great Gatsby curve, the finding that among advanced economies, greater income inequality is associated with diminished intergenerational mobility." And again, we have a graph that shows the relationship. The y-axis, which is the vertical axis, shows decreasing mobility. As you go up the y-axis, you're having less and less mobility. And the x-axis shows increasing income inequality. And once again, we have the United States in the far right-hand upper corner with the highest level of income inequality in this sample of nations. and also with among the highest level of immobility from generation to generation. Lastly, there has been quite a bit of documentation in the US political problems arising from inequality. An article in the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences summarized this relationship, stating, quote, "The American creed stresses political equality and political involvement, but participation and political authority in America are highly stratified by income and education. People with higher income and education are more active participants in American politics. They are more likely to have their interests represented by lobbyists, and they are more likely to have their opinions count for policy outcomes." Martin Gilens, one of the leading political scientists in this area, echoed the findings of the others, commenting, quote, "When preferences of the middle class and the affluent align in my data, responsiveness by policymakers is strong and equal for these two groups and essentially non-existent for the poor. But when middle class preferences align with those of the poor, in which case you would expect that there would be more responsiveness to the middle class and the poor, he found responsiveness to the affluent remains strong, while responsiveness to the poor and middle class is completely absent. In sum, the responsiveness of policymakers to the preferences of the American public is highly skewed in favor of the most affluent, and this remains true even when we isolate those policies on which the preferences of the poor and the middle class converge." So the result is that inequality is also posing a threat to the operations of our democracy. In conclusion, efficiency's appeal is not supported by theory or current empirical evidence. Theory cannot predict the efficiency effects of the individual income tax. Moreover, the impact of the tax as an empirical matter is highly uncertain. Economists agree that empirical studies show that individual income taxes in the US have little or no effect on labor supply. There is no consensus in the empirical studies about the impact of such taxes on savings. In contrast, the harms associated with inequality to our health, societal well-being, intergenerational mobility, and democracy appear to be more statistically certain. Consequently, there is no clear case for prioritizing efficiency over equity. Thank you very much.
Thank you.